The tow truck arrived at Voss Auto Salvage at 5:47 in the morning. Not 6, not 7. 5:47 before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge above Dolan Flats, Arizona, before the birds had started their second round, before a single business on Main Street had turned its sign from closed to open. The driver, a man named Gary Holt, had a work order clipped to his visor and a thermos of bad coffee wedged between his knees, and no particular feelings about any of it. He was doing a job. He had done this kind of early pickup before salvage operators sometimes needed a vehicle moved before business hours, before neighbors noticed, before anyone had the opportunity to say, wait. He backed the truck through the front gate, which Harlan Voss had left unlatched the night before, with a handwritten note reading, "Take the blue Mustang back row, third from the south fence. Keys in office drop box." Gary had found the note, found the keys, found the car without difficulty. He climbed out, set his brake, and began threading the tow cable under the front frame with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. The amber lights on the roof of his truck swept the yard in slow, indifferent circles. Inside the Mustang, in the back seat, a boy was asleep. Danny Pruitt had come through the gap in the south fence the previous night at 10 past 10, the same way he had come every night for the past 3 months, turning sideways, holding his breath, pressing through the bent chain link until the yard opened around him. He had walked the familiar path through the rows of dead cars, the way you walk through a house you grew up in the dark, knowing every corner, every turn, every obstacle, your body navigating from memory while your mind goes somewhere else entirely. He had opened the rear door of the Mustang quietly and climbed in and pulled it closed and laid his jacket across the seat for a pillow. He had taken off one sneaker, just the left one, because it had started to rub, and left it on the floor. He had put his notebook on the seat beside him, the way a person keeps something important close when they sleep, and he had closed his eyes. The Mustang's back seat smelled like his father. That was the reason. That was the whole reason, as simple and as enormous as that. The car smelled like Roy Pruitt, like the specific combination of old leather and engine oil, and the Old Spice aftershave his father had used every morning of his life, applied with 3 pats to the jaw, the same 3 pats, every single day, a ritual so consistent that Danny could still feel the rhythm of it if he closed his eyes and stayed very still. The smell had faded from the house on Mesquite Street by December. His father's pillow, which Danny had kept pressed against his face for 2 weeks after the accident, had lost it by Christmas. His father's flannel shirt, which Danny had taken from the closet and hidden under his own bed, had held it until February. The Mustang had held it still. He did not know how much longer it would last. He understood, in the way children understand things they haven't been told directly, that smells were not permanent, that they faded like everything else, that one morning he would climb into the back seat, and the particular combination that meant father would be gone, replaced by the neutral smell of dust and old vinyl and time. He was trying to be with it while it was still there. He was trying to memorize it. He was doing what 11-year-old boys do when they have no other tools available. He was holding on with his body to something his mind couldn't hold alone. He was not a dramatic child. He was not given to performances of grief that made adults uncomfortable and then relieved when they ended. He was quiet in the way his father had been quiet, absorbing, patient, reading the world carefully before responding to it. Roy Pruitt had taught his son that if you understood how a thing worked, you could never truly lose it. Danny was still trying to believe that. But understanding how an engine worked and understanding how to live without the man who had taught you were different categories of knowledge, and the second one had not come with a manual. He slept in the Mustang because it was the last place in the world that still felt like his father was somewhere nearby. He had been asleep for about 2 hours when the amber lights began their sweep. The first pass didn't wake him. The second turned behind his eyelids, and he shifted, pulling his jacket tighter. The third came with sound, the diesel idle of the tow truck, deep and close, sending a low vibration through the Mustang's frame, up through the seat springs, into the bones of a sleeping boy. Then came the lurch. The tow hook found the frame, and Gary Holt pulled the first length of cable taut, and the Mustang moved not far, not violently, but enough, 6 inches forward. A hard mechanical pull that rattled every loose component in the dash, that woke the car in the way that engines don't wake but bodies do, with a shudder and a groan. Danny's eyes opened. He was on his feet in 4 seconds, out the rear door in 5, standing in the cold Arizona pre-dawn in one shoe, jacket half on, notebook clutched in his right hand. looking at the tow truck and the cable and Gary Holt in his orange vest crouching at the front of the Mustang, threading the hook toward the tie-down point. "Stop," Danny said. Gary Holt looked up. He straightened slowly. He was a reasonable man, and he could see a child standing in the pale amber light, with one shoe on and both hands out, and an expression that combined terror and determination in the specific way that only children in genuine crisis manage. It was the expression of someone who has run all the way to the edge of what they have and is standing on it. "Son," Gary said carefully, "you need to step back from the vehicle." "This is my father's car," Danny said. "I have a work order," Gary said. He held it up, as if the paper itself would explain everything and resolve it cleanly. "This vehicle was signed over for pickup. You shouldn't be in this yard. This is private property." "I know it's private property," Danny said. His voice was steady, which surprised him. He pressed both hands flat against the Mustang's trunk lid. The metal was cold and slightly damp with the desert night. He could feel the solidity of it, the weight and reality of the car his father had built, pressing back against his palms. "I know all of that. But you cannot take this car." "Son, please," Danny said. The word came out raw. Not performed, not calculated, just the last word available to a boy who had run out of everything else. "Please." A single syllable carrying the full weight of 8 months of loss, aimed at a reasonable man with a work order and a thermos of bad coffee, and no idea what he had stumbled into. Gary Holt straightened up. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at his work order, and looked at the boy, and looked at the work order again. It was in this moment, this precise, suspended moment, the amber light turning slow circles over the boy in the car, and the cold gravel, that the man at the edge of the yard made his presence known. He had parked the dark green Porsche on the shoulder of the road outside the fence, and come through the gate on foot, silently, and had been standing near the first row of cars for perhaps 2 minutes. He had seen everything. The truck, the cable, the boy erupting from the rear door, the stand at the trunk. He had watched all of it without moving, the way a man watches when he needs to understand the full shape of a thing before deciding what to do about it. He was medium height, compact, wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt under a jacket he'd thrown on against the morning chill. He was 36 years old, and he had a face that most of America would have recognized immediately in daylight, with sufficient notice. In the amber half-dark of a salvage yard at 10 minutes before 6 in the morning, he was simply a man watching a boy hold his ground against a tow truck, watching with the calm, measuring attention of someone who had already begun working out what came next. The amber light swept across the yard and caught him once. Just once. A face that was composed and careful, and had seen enough of the world to know what it was looking at. He did not announce himself. He walked forward slowly and stopped a few feet from Gary Holt. "What time does Harlan Voss open?" he said. Gary looked at him. 6 or so. "Call him now," the man said. Gary looked between the man and the boy, and the work order in his hand. He was a reasonable man, and the situation had acquired a texture that his thermos of coffee had not prepared him for. He walked to his truck and picked up the radio. Danny looked at the man. The man looked at Danny. "You sleeping in there?" the man said. "Yes, sir," Danny said. His hands were still on the trunk. The man looked at the Mustang. He looked at it the way certain people look at certain things, slowly, carefully, reading something in its proportions and its condition that required patience to understand. Then he looked back at the boy. "It was your father's," he said. "It was not a question." "He built the engine himself," Danny said. "He was going to finish it. We were going to finish it together." The man nodded once. He said nothing more. He moved to lean against the adjacent wreck with his arms folded, and he waited for Harlan Voss in the growing light. And there was something in the particular stillness of him, in the way he occupied the space, without announcing himself in it, that made Danny feel, for the first time since the cable had hit the frame, that the situation might not be entirely lost. The amber lights kept turning. The desert kept its silence. The boy kept his hands on the car. And the man kept watching, already 3 steps into a problem he had only just encountered, already knowing it mattered. Harlan Voss arrived at 6:12. He came fast, his truck throwing gravel as it came through the gate, because Gary Holt had not explained the situation well on the radio, and Harlan had filled in the blanks with several scenarios, none of them good. He found Gary leaning against the tow truck, drinking from his thermos. He found Danny Pruitt sitting on the cold ground with his back against the Mustang's rear tire, knees up, notebook open across his thighs, hand moving steadily across the page. And he found a man he didn't recognize leaning against a derelict Ford wagon nearby, watching everything with the patient stillness of someone who was in no particular hurry and had no intention of being moved along. "Lord Almighty," Harlan said, which covered most of what needed to be said about the scene in front of him. He sent Gary to the gate with instructions to wait. He crouched in front of Danny. Harlan Voss was 58 years old, built wide, with hands that had clearly been used for everything they'd ever needed to do. He was not a man who showed much on his face or said more than was necessary, but he had known, for 3 months, that this boy was coming into his yard at night. He had known about the gap in the south fence and had not fixed it, and he had not examined too closely his reasons for not fixing it, because some things were easier not to examine. "How long you been here tonight?" Harlan said. "Since 10, Danny said without looking up from the notebook. "Every night?" "Most nights." Harlan looked at the notebook. The page was covered in a precise diagram of the Mustang's engine, not a child's drawing, not a rough sketch, but a careful technical rendering with labeled components, measurements noted in the margins, and small annotations in the same neat printing that filled every page of the book. "You draw that from memory," Harlan said. "I don't need to look at the engine anymore," Danny said simply. "I know it." Harlan straightened up slowly. He looked at the car. He looked at the stranger near the wagon. "Who are you?" Harlan said. "I was here yesterday looking for a carburetor," the man said. "My name is Steve." He offered it without a last name, which Harlan noted but didn't push on. People passing through small towns sometimes did that, and it was generally their business why. "What's your interest in this situation?" Harlan said. "I saw the engine yesterday," Steve said. "I'd like to look at it again, if that's all right." Harlan considered the request. Then he looked at Danny. "Show him," Harlan said. Danny stood without a word. He went to the front of the Mustang and released the hood latch the way his father had shown him 2 fingers, firm pressure at the secondary release. He raised the hood with both hands and propped it open. Steve came forward. He looked at the engine the way he'd been looking at it since the previous night slowly, with the patience of someone reading something complex rather than scanning it for highlights. He crouched at the front corner and examined the block from below. He straightened and studied the valve covers, the ignition setup, the intake manifold, the way the carburetor was mounted. He touched almost nothing. What he did touch, he touched briefly, and with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what information his fingers would return. He was quiet for nearly a full minute. In a salvage yard at 6 in the morning, with a tow truck idling at the gate, that minute was a long one. "Your father replaced both cylinder heads," he said to Danny, without looking up. "Both of them," Danny said. "He said the originals were too conservative for what the engine wanted to do." Steve looked at the heads. "He was right," he said. "He spent 8 months finding the right ones," Danny said. "He wrote letters to 3 different shops." "I can see the work," Steve said. He straightened and looked at the carburetor. "Wrong model on the carb, though." "Wrong." "I know," Danny said. He knew. "We were going to order the Holly when he got back from his last run." "What model?" Steve said. Danny gave him the model number, the specific reason it was the correct match for this particular engine configuration, and the name of the shop in Albuquerque where Roy had planned to order it. He gave all of this from memory, in the straightforward manner of a child for whom the information was not stored but simply known, absorbed through years of standing at this engine bay with a man who believed that understanding something deeply was the best way to love it. Steve looked at him for a moment. "Your father ever mention where the car came from before he bought it?" Steve said. "Before the auction?" Danny thought. "He said it had been somewhere. An auto show, maybe. He said when he first started the engine, he couldn't believe how it ran. He said it felt like there was more car underneath than the outside showed." Steve nodded slowly. He lowered the hood with both hands, carefully. "The way you lower the hood of a car that deserves the gesture." He turned to Harlan. "Cancel the pickup," he said. "Give me until this afternoon." "I've got a deposit on this car," Harlan said. "From who?" "Man named Curtis Dane. Out of Scottsdale." "Return it," Steve said. "Something about this situation needs looking at before any sale goes forward." Harlan looked at him steadily. There was something about the man's face that continued to nag at him, not quite recognition, not quite familiarity, but the persistent sense that the face belonged to a category his brain was working to locate and hadn't quite gotten there yet. "Until noon," Harlan said finally. No longer. He walked Gary Holt back to his truck and said what needed to be said. Gary unhooked the cable, loaded his equipment, and drove the tow truck back out through the gate and onto the main road. The amber lights disappeared around the curve. Danny stood in the growing daylight and listened to the truck go. He let out a breath that had apparently been stored since the moment he'd felt the car move. He turned and found Steve watching him. "Why are you helping?" Danny said. He said it directly, without preamble. A boy who had learned in the past 8 months that directness saved time, that grief had made precious. Steve looked at the car. The early morning light was coming over the eastern ridge now, warm and low, finding the Mustang's faded paint and pulling something honest out of it, not quite blue anymore, not quite gray, a color that changed depending on what the light decided to show. Roy had called it honest color. He'd said the car told you what kind of day it was by the way the paint looked in the morning. "Your father built something real," Steve said. "It deserves better than 20 minutes and a tow hook." He said it simply, and then he walked back through the yard and got in the Porsche and drove south on the main road, and the sound of that engine tuned correctly, running cleanly faded into the desert morning. Danny stood beside the Mustang. He put his hand on the hood, pressing his palm against the metal the same way he'd pressed it against the trunk, confirming, through the solid reality of it, that it was still here. He could feel, through his palm, the faint warmth beginning to build as the sun climbed. He stayed there for a long time. Behind him, in the small office near the gate, Harlan Voss sat at his desk and picked up the phone and put it back down and picked it up again, and sat with it in his hand for a long time without dialing the number he was thinking about dialing. Curtis Dane's Lincoln Continental came through the gate of Voss Auto Salvage at 9:32 that morning, moving with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle whose driver expected the world to accommodate it. Curtis got out, tan slacks, pale blue shirt with the collar open, brown leather portfolio tucked under one arm. His boots were calfskin, the kind that started expensive and stayed that way, polished that morning, not a mark on them despite the drive from Flagstaff where he'd spent the night. He was 51 years old and carried himself with the particular bearing of a man who had learned early that projecting certainty produced results roughly equivalent to actually being certain, and had built a successful career on not examining the difference too closely. He dealt in rare and vintage American vehicles. He attended auctions from California to Virginia, and drove home having paid less than things were worth, and sold them for more, and called the gap between those numbers his expertise. He had a climate-controlled storage facility in Scottsdale with 12 cars in it at any given time, each one documented and assigned a value that increased annually by virtue of sitting still in the right conditions. He did not love cars. He understood them at the level of the ledger, which he had found to be considerably more profitable than the level of the heart. Harlan met him at the gate. They shook hands in the manner of men conducting business who had not yet determined whether they liked each other and were proceeding on the assumption that liking was not required. "I expected the car to be ready," Curtis said, scanning the lot with the automatic professional assessment of someone who priced things on instinct. "There was a situation this morning," Harlan said. Curtis's expression did not change. "What kind of situation?" "Let's walk," Harlan said. They moved through the yard. The morning heat was building, not the serious afternoon heat that would come later, but the preliminary variety, polite enough for now. Curtis's eyes moved across the inventory the way a man's eyes move when he has trained them to see value in things that look like ruin. His gaze skipped past corroded hulks and rested briefly on anything with structural integrity or promising provenance. He had spent 20 years developing that gaze and trusted it completely. The Mustang sat at the back of the lot, where it always sat in the narrow space between the gutted Chevy pickup and the roofless station wagon, half in morning shadow, the paint faded but the body solid, and the proportions entirely right. In the growing light, it looked better than it had any right to look. Certain cars have a quality of being entirely themselves, regardless of their circumstances present, considered, not apologizing. The Mustang had that quality. Curtis stopped 10 feet away. He walked a slow circuit checking panel gaps, roof condition, door alignment, the state of the floor rails visible through the partially open driver's door. He opened the driver's door and checked the dashboard. He came to the front. "Hood," he said. Harlan released the latch. Curtis looked at the engine. Something happened in his face, very small, very controlled. A tightening around the eyes that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before he smoothed it away. The tightening of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected and is deciding how to handle having confirmed it. "Who worked on this?" he said. "Previous owner," Harlan said. "Man named Roy Pruitt worked on it for 4 years. He knew what he was doing," Curtis said. "Flat assessment, no warmth. He was a mechanic," Harlan said. "He was more than a mechanic," Curtis said. He closed the hood. He opened his portfolio and removed a single typed page and set it on the Mustang's hood with the calm authority of a man placing a card he's confident in. $2,000, he said. "Cash. Today. I'll have a trailer here by 3. Harlan looked at the page. "I told you on the phone I needed to think," Harlan said. "You've had overnight," Curtis said pleasantly. $2,000 is a strong offer for a car in this condition. I'm taking on the restoration cost and the market risk. You're walking away clean." There was a brief negotiation that went nowhere useful, Harlan pushing, Curtis adjusting minimally and calling it generosity, and it ended with Curtis at $2,200, final, and Harlan saying he needed until end of day. Curtis agreed to return at 5 and walked back to his Continental with his portfolio and his clean boots and the precise, organized knowledge of exactly what he was leaving behind and what he intended to do with it. What Curtis Dane had not told Harlan, and had no intention of telling him, was what he had recognized in that engine bay. 18 months earlier, a retired Ford engineer who had worked at the San Jose plant in 1963 had circulated a private document among a small group of serious collectors. A document describing a limited batch of early Mustangs that had been built to demonstrate the car's performance potential before the public launch began. These vehicles had been built to specification for press events and selected dealer introductions. Most had returned to Ford. A handful had been sold through dealer channels without documentation of what made them different. The document described, in technical detail, exactly the engine configuration Curtis had just looked at. He had been searching for one of these cars for over a year. He had found it in a salvage yard in a town most people drove through without stopping, and he had offered $2,200 for it, and he expected to drive back to Scottsdale by Friday with something worth 10 times that. He was not troubled by this. He was in the business of finding things people didn't know they had and paying them what they thought it was worth. It was, he told himself, simply commerce. What he was not accounting for was the dark green Porsche parked outside the fence that morning, and the man who had come back to look at an engine he'd been thinking about since midnight. June Pruitt got home from her shift at Pauline's Diner at 4:15 that afternoon. She was 34 years old, and she moved through her house with the efficiency of someone who had been on her feet since 6 and had perhaps 45 minutes before she needed to start dinner. She changed out of her uniform. She put water on the stove. She went to the window and looked at the driveway, an old habit, checking for Roy's truck, a habit she had not yet managed to break, and saw the empty rectangle of concrete where the truck had been and, before the truck, where the Mustang had been under its tarp. She stood at the window for a moment. She had been doing better. That was the honest assessment, applied carefully and without embellishment. She had been doing better. The first month had been unsurvivable, and she had survived it. The second month had been slightly less unsurvivable, and she had survived that too. By April, she had found a rhythm work in sleep, and the careful rationing of feeling that kept her functional in front of Danny, who needed her functional more than he needed her honest. She went to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. The box was under it. It had always been under the bed throughout their marriage, throughout their life in Dolan Flats. Roy's box for documents and photographs, and the small items that didn't belong anywhere specific but belonged somewhere. She had pushed it against the wall after November and had not opened it since February. When she'd gone through it looking for insurance paperwork and had instead found 3 photographs of Roy and Danny at the garage, Danny, maybe 7 years old, both of them looking at something in an engine bay with matching expressions of total concentration, and had put the photographs face down on the floor and sat very still for a long time before she could continue. She had not gone back to the box since. She reached under the bed and pulled it out. She removed the lid. The contents were familiar insurance papers, their marriage certificate, warranty documents, 2 stacks of receipts she recognized as Mustang-related. A flat envelope with her name on it in Roy's handwriting, which she set aside. The photograph of Roy's parents at their New Mexico farm. A small stack of letters from Roy's mother bound with a rubber band. And at the bottom of the box, underneath everything else, The engine manual. She picked it up carefully. It was a Ford shop manual, the specific edition for the 289 V8, its cover worn at the corners and the spine cracked from years of opening. Roy had owned it before they met. It was already worn the first time she'd seen it, sitting open on the kitchen table in his Phoenix apartment on the night of their first dinner together. She remembered thinking it was an odd thing to have out at dinner, and then deciding it was endearing, and then finding Roy himself endearing in a broader sense, which had led to the dinner becoming a walk and a very long conversation on his apartment steps. She opened the manual to the first marked page. Roy's handwriting was everywhere. In the margins, at the tops and bottoms of pages, between diagrams, small, careful printing that she would have recognized in a crowd of 1,000 handwritings, in blue or black ink depending on what had been available, notes about specifications and tolerances, part numbers, supplier names, the names of shops he'd written to in other states. She turned pages slowly, reading fragments of his thinking, the methodical way he'd worked through problems, noting what he'd tried, what had worked, what he planned to try next. On page 47, he had written, "Danny will know this page. Make sure." On page 83, the carburetor question, see notes in back. She turned to the back. On the final blank pages, Roy had made a master list. Every remaining task, every part still needed, with part numbers and supplier contacts and estimated costs written in 2 columns. At the top, underlined, Holly Carb right model, this is the last major piece. Below the list, in larger writing, in the deliberate hand of someone who was saying something that mattered. For Danny, this engine will run the way it deserves to run. We are going to drive this car to California and see the ocean, and that is a promise I intend to keep. June sat on the floor of her bedroom and read that line several times. That is a promise I intend to keep. She had known Roy Pruitt for 8 years. She had loved him honestly and argued with him occasionally and built a life with him in a small town that was never quite what either of them had imagined. But that had turned out to be enough, and more than enough, because the life had contained Roy and Danny and a house with a garage and a blue Mustang that Roy had been building into a promise he had not had time to fulfill. She had sold that car for $350. She set the manual down. She picked up the flat envelope with her name on it, Roy's handwriting on the front, the seal still intact. She turned it over twice. He had addressed it to her and she had never opened it, and she opened it now. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. Roy had never been a man of many words. On paper he expressed himself best in action, in the things he built and fixed, and decided quietly and stuck to. The letter was 3 short paragraphs. The first said he was writing on a Tuesday night before a long run, because that was a habit he had and had never had reason to stop. The second said everything was in order, or close enough, and listed 3 practical things: the filing cabinet, the truck's oil, a phone number for the water heater. The third paragraph said, "The car is for Danny. I know you know that, but I put it in writing at the notary last month, just to be sure. He's going to be a good mechanic, June. Better than me. If someone gives him the time, please give him the time." June folded the letter. She folded it a second time, pressing the creases flat with both thumbs, the way you press something carefully when it is irreplaceable and you want it to last. She put it in the pocket of her cardigan. She got up off the floor. She went to the kitchen and turned off the water that had been boiling for 20 minutes. She picked up the phone. She dialed the salvage yard. Harlan answered on the second ring. "I need to know something," June said. "About the car." Steve McQueen was back in room 6 of the Copper Ridge Motor Lodge by 7:30 in the morning. He had stopped at a gas station on the way and bought a large coffee in a paper cup and carried it to the room and set it on the small desk and sat down in the wooden chair. He did not drink the coffee immediately. He sat with it cooling and thought in the systematic, unhurried way he'd always thought best, starting from what was certain and moving carefully toward what needed to be confirmed. Certain. The Mustang at Voss Auto Salvage was not a standard car. The engine told him that without ambiguity. The cylinder heads Roy had sourced were incompatible with a stock 289 configuration, unless you knew exactly what you were building toward, knew the specific combination of cam profile and valve timing and intake flow that the factory performance setup had been designed around. Roy had known. He'd worked toward it across 4 years, and hadn't fully understood why the combination worked as well as it did, only that it did, because his instincts were that good. The full origin was what Steve needed to confirm. He picked up the phone. Gerald Fitch answered on the fourth ring. Gerald operated out of a warehouse in Van Nuys, California, where he maintained the most comprehensive private archive of American automotive production records that existed outside the Ford Motor Company's own vaults. He'd assembled it across 2 decades through purchases, trades, and one particularly well-timed friendship with a Ford archivist who had been grateful for help with a personal situation. Steve had once helped Gerald acquire a document from a private New Mexico estate. The favor had never been called in. Until now. Pre-production records, Steve said, after the minimal greeting. Early Mustang, San Jose plant, spring of '63, before full production. What's the VIN? Gerald said. Steve read it from memory. He had memorized it the night before while standing at the open driver's door with his flashlight. The pause on Gerald's end was long enough that Steve drank half his coffee. Where did you find this car? Gerald said finally. His voice had the quality of a man trying to contain something professional. Arizona salvage yard, Steve said. Stephen. A pause. This is one of the San Jose advance allocation vehicles. Early 1963. Ford built a small number of Mustangs, fewer than 40, before full production began, specifically to demonstrate what the platform was capable of to press and to select dealer representatives. These weren't prototypes. They were fully built, road-ready cars, constructed to a performance specification that never appeared on any production model. Modified valve timing, Steve said. The intake. The bottom end. All of it, Gerald said. Factory fitted. The combination was designed to show what the car could do when properly built. Most of these vehicles were used at press events and returned to Ford. A small number were sold through dealer channels when the program wrapped up. The buyers got exceptional cars. They didn't get paperwork explaining why. The previous owner knew the engine was better than standard, Steve said. He didn't know the full history. How did he find it? Auction in Tucson, Steve said. 63. That tracks, Gerald said. Several of these cars entered private hands through dealer liquidations. No documentation followed them. A pause. What's the current condition? The engine has been substantially rebuilt by someone who understood what he was working with, even without knowing why. The work is exceptional. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Authenticated. With the production history documented, Steve, this car is worth $12,000 to $15,000 at minimum to the right collector. At a proper specialty auction with everything confirmed, I wouldn't try to predict the ceiling. Steve set down his coffee. I need you to put together everything that confirms the VIN and the production history, Steve said. Overnight to Flagstaff. I'll give you the name in an hour. He got the name an hour later, after his second call. Patricia Wells had practiced property and family law in Flagstaff for 12 years. She was methodical and not easily impressed by anything except well-prepared arguments. Steve had met her once through a mutual contact, a stunt driver whose estate had been improperly handled by a studio. She had resolved it cleanly. He told her about the title. The Mustang registered solely in Roy's name. The notarized notation designating Danny. The sale by June after Roy's death. He gave it to her in order, without editorializing, which was how he communicated information that needed to be used. Patricia listened without interrupting. The notary stamp is the critical element, she said when he finished. I thought so, Steve said. A handwritten margin note on a title document is weak on its own, she said. But Roy didn't just write his son's name, he took that title to a notary and had the notation officially witnessed and stamped. That's a documented record of his intent. It's not a will, but in Arizona it creates real questions about whether June had complete authority to sell a vehicle registered only in his name, given that documented intent. Enough to stop the sale? Steve said. Enough that any buyer who knows about it has to think carefully, Patricia said. Because if they buy with knowledge of the dispute, and the family later challenges it, that buyer has a problem. A collector planning to resell at auction has even more to lose. You can't sell clean at auction with a clouded title. Can you be in Dolan Flats tomorrow morning at 8? Steve said. A pause. Send me the address, she said. He hung up and made one more call. Earl Bunker in Phoenix ran the largest Ford specialty parts operation in the Southwest and owed Steve a favor from a racing event 2 years prior. Steve read from his notebook Roy Pruitt's list, copied from the manual pages Danny had shown him at the open hood. Every remaining part, every specification. The Holly carburetor, correct model, 4 supporting components. All of it. Address for delivery? Earl said. Daniel Roy Pruitt, Steve said. He gave the house number on Mesquite Street. Overnight if you can. Done, Earl said. Then, Steve, whoever built this parts list knew exactly what they were working with. I know, Steve said. That's the point. He hung up. He looked at the wall of room 6 for a moment. Then he put on his jacket and drove back to the salvage yard. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dolan Flats had formed an opinion. This was not unusual. Dolan Flats had approximately 900 residents and the civic metabolism of a much smaller community, which meant that information moved through it with a speed and completeness that bore no relationship to the accuracy of what moved. What people believed they knew by mid-afternoon was a rough composite of several partial accounts stitched together with assumption. The Pruitt boy had been sleeping in Voss's yard. A man from Scottsdale was buying the car. A stranger was involved, and the car was worth considerably more than what the family had received for it. What people did with this information depended on who they were. At Pauline's diner, where June was working her second shift, the conversation settled at the counter, the way it always settled there, without invitation, without structure, with the combined authority of people who believed their proximity to a situation constituted a position on it. Bobby Arlen came in at 2:15. He was a roofer who had lived in Dolan Flats his entire life and shared his opinions without being asked, which people found either useful or exhausting, depending on whether they agreed with him. She sold the car, Bobby said to Pete Schumacher, who had come from the feed store for coffee and was already regretting the conversation he could see forming. Legal sale. Man paid her, she signed. She took the money. You can't want something back just because it turns out to be worth more than you knew. She didn't know, Pete said. That's different from knowing and accepting. Not legally, Bobby said. I wasn't talking about legally, Pete said. Then what were you talking about? Pete looked at his coffee. I was talking about a woman who lost her husband in November and was barely keeping the lights on and sold something she shouldn't have sold because she didn't know what it was. That's life, Bobby said. That happens to people. It happened to June Pruitt specifically, Pete said. And the man buying that car knew what it was worth when he offered $2,200. Bobby said nothing. This was not agreement, but it was something less than complete disagreement. From the far end of the counter, May Gruder said, The boy has been sleeping in that yard for 3 months. Both men looked at her. May was not someone who contributed to counter conversations unless she had reached the point where silence had become insufficient. She had clearly reached that point. Every night, she said, since February, in the back seat of that car, because it's the last place in the world that still smells like his father. She looked at Bobby Arlen with the steady gaze of a woman who had known him for 30 years and was currently setting that aside. You tell me where he's supposed to go. You tell me what an 11-year-old boy is supposed to do when the only place he can find his father is in the back seat of a car that's about to be towed to Scottsdale. Bobby looked at his coffee. June had been at the far end of the counter refilling sugar dispensers and had heard all of it. Because the counter was not large, and Dolan Flats was not large, and people did not lower their voices when they believed they were discussing an abstraction, which was what they tended to do when the person the abstraction concerned was standing 10 feet away. She finished the last sugar dispenser. She set it down. She told the cook through the pass-through that she needed 10 minutes. She went out the side door into the alley. She stood with her back against the brick in the afternoon heat and looked at the strip of sky above the buildings opposite and put her hand in her cardigan pocket and felt the envelope there, Roy's letter, its edges familiar now from a day of touching. He's going to be a good mechanic, June. Better than me. If someone gives him the time, please give him the time. She had sold the car. She had sold it because she'd needed the money and because she couldn't look at it, and because she'd told herself it was just a machine. What Danny needed was food and warmth, and a mother who kept the lights on. Not a car sitting under a tarp getting further from finished. She had told herself those things because they were true, and because they allowed her to do what she had needed to do, which was survive. She did not blame herself for surviving. But she stood in the alley, and she thought about Roy writing, "That is a promise I intend to keep," and she thought about Danny in the back seat every night for 3 months, breathing in the last of his father that the world had left him, and she thought, I sold that. She pressed her hand flat against the letter in her pocket. Then she went back inside. She picked up the coffee pot. She refilled Bobby Arlen's cup without being asked, And when he opened his mouth, she said, quietly but with a completeness that didn't invite response, "I know, Bobby. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just asking you to be quiet for a little while." Bobby was quiet for a little while. June looked at the window that faced the street. Through it, Dolan Flats went about its afternoon. She thought, someone is trying to help us. And then, I need to be home when Danny gets there. She untied her apron. The following morning, before Curtis Dane arrived, Harlan Voss drove to Pauline's diner. He had not been there in 3 years. His wife had died, and he had stopped going to places where people gathered, because gathering had felt wrong when the specific person he most wanted to gather with was gone. The habit had dissolved slowly enough that he'd barely noticed until it was entirely absent, and then it had seemed too late to reconstruct without explanation, and the easier path had been simply to stay away. He came in through the front door at 7:45. The breakfast crowd was still present, 8 or 10 people at tables and counter seats, the smell of coffee and bacon, and the steady morning sound of a diner that had been open since 5 and found its rhythm. June saw him from behind the counter. She came around immediately. They stood near the entrance. Harlan had his hat in his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was even not performing this, not working toward an effect, just saying something that needed to be said. "And I need to tell it here." The diner did not go dramatically quiet, but it shifted the way a room shifts when something important has entered it, the general attention redistributing itself while maintaining the appearance of its previous activity. "There was a man who came to my yard in March," Harlan said, "an appraiser from Tucson. He was looking through my inventory for a client. He spent about 10 minutes on your husband's car." He stopped. He looked at his hat. "When he left," Harlan said, "he told me I should be careful what I did with that vehicle. He didn't give me a number. He didn't explain it. But I've been in this business for 23 years, and I know what that kind of comment means." He met June's eyes. "I thought about calling you that same day. I thought about it more than once, over more than 1 week. And I didn't call. I told myself the sale was done, and it was business, and you'd agreed to the price, and it wasn't my responsibility anymore." He paused. "That was wrong. I'm sorry for it." The diner was quiet, actually quiet. May Gruder was in her booth. Pete Schumacher was at a back table. Bobby Arlen was at the counter. None of them were pretending not to listen. June looked at Harlan for a long moment. She thought about February, Harlan walking around the car twice, offering $350, saying it needed a lot of work and he wasn't running a charity. She had believed him because she'd had no reason not to, and because grief had consumed the mental capacity she would normally have applied to skepticism. "How much is it worth?" she said. "The man helping us, Steve, he had someone pull the factory records," Harlan said. "This is an early pre-production Mustang, built before the public launch, with a factory performance setup that was never offered on any car sold to the public. Value, properly documented and authenticated, between $12,000 and $15,000. The number moved through the diner the way an unexpected sound moves through a quiet room completely, touching every corner. Bobby Arlen set his coffee cup down with a sound. May Gruder closed her eyes briefly. June stood with her hands at her sides and let the arithmetic complete itself. $350 against $12,000. The heating bill and the refrigerator repair and Danny's shoes against 4 years of Roy's weekends. The practical decision she'd made in February against the promise Roy had written at the back of a manual. "I would have found a way," she said quietly. "If I'd known, I would have found a way to keep it." "I know," Harlan said. "I'm going to get it back," she said. Not a question. Not an expression of hope. A statement from a woman who had been living on intention for 8 months and had gotten very good at it. "There's a lawyer and the man Steve," Harlan said. "They'll be at the yard at 8. "I'll be there," June said. Harlan put his hat back on. He looked around the room at the faces he recognized, at the community he had been part of for his entire life, at the people who now knew something about him that he would have preferred to keep private but had chosen to make public because some things require witnesses to become real. He walked out. The door closed. The diner held its quiet for a moment. Then May Gruder said to June, "Go. My shift." "Eddie," May said through the pass-through. "June needs to leave." Eddie, who was 60 years old and had worked this diner for 22 of them and had heard everything, said, "Go on, June." June untied her apron for the second time in 2 days. Bobby Arlen, to no one in particular, said, $12,000. He said it the way a man says something when he is revising a position he held with more confidence than it deserved. He left a 50-cent tip. He never left more than a dime. June understood what it meant and accepted it without comment. Curtis Dane arrived at Voss Auto Salvage at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes early, which was a statement. He drove through the gate and parked the Continental with precision and got out carrying his leather portfolio and a second folder, thicker, which his Phoenix lawyer had prepared the previous evening. He had spent 45 minutes on the phone with that lawyer and had come away with a documented legal position and what he considered adequate leverage. He found the yard assembled in a way he had not expected. Harlan near the gate, a woman with a briefcase and a professional bearing standing beside an unfamiliar car, June Pruitt and Danny walking in from the road, and the man in the plain jacket leaning against the salvage yard fence with his arms folded and his face entirely composed. Curtis assessed this in about 3 seconds. He decided it was manageable. "I've had my attorney look at the title situation," Curtis said to Harlan, opening his thick folder. "The sale from Mrs. Pruitt to you was valid. A notarized notation expressing intent is not the same as a legal transfer of ownership. My attorney has the case citations if anyone wants them." "Good morning," Patricia Wells said pleasantly. She set her briefcase on the hood of a nearby car and opened it with the unhurried calm of someone who had prepared more thoroughly than the person she was speaking with. Curtis looked at her. He had looked her up the night before. "Your attorney's analysis is reasonable as far as it goes," Patricia said, laying Gerald Fitch's documentation on the hood, the VIN confirmation, the factory records, the production history, all of it organized and clearly labeled. "But there's a layer he may not have had access to. This vehicle is a pre-production Mustang, built at the San Jose plant in the spring of 1963 as part of an advanced demonstration program. Fewer than 40 were made. The engine has a factory performance configuration that was never offered on any production car sold to the public." Curtis looked at the documents. He looked at them for longer than he needed to simply read them. "I'm aware the car has production history," he said. "My offer reflects the uncertainty around authentication and resale." $2,200, Patricia said, "for a vehicle the records support valuing at $12,000 to $15,000. That value assumes authentication, the right buyer, a favorable auction environment," Curtis said. "I'm absorbing all of that risk." "Absorbing roughly $9,000 or $10,000 of it," June said. She said it quietly, from where she stood a few feet away. Not angry. Precise. "At our expense." Curtis turned to her. He made his voice reasonable. "Mrs. Pruitt, you made a legal sale to Mr. Voss. Whatever Mr. Voss and I subsequently." "I'd like to ask you something," Steve said. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked at him. He had not moved from the fence. His voice was level, the same as everything he said, not loud, not soft, carrying across the morning air, with the quality of someone who says things once and means them exactly. Curtis turned. "This is a private transaction. You don't have standing." "The carburetor in that engine," Steve said. "What model is it?" A pause. "I didn't examine the carburetor specifically," Curtis said. "You had the hood open for 4 minutes yesterday morning," Steve said. "You saw the engine. What model is the carburetor?" "I don't see how that's relevant to the legal." "What's the valve timing specification for the factory performance package on this production run?" Steve said. Same voice, same pace. The same expression that was no expression at all, just attention, just waiting. Another pause, longer. "I'm not here to take an exam," Curtis said. There was an edge in it now. "The cam profile," Steve said. "What makes it different from the standard 289? Curtis said nothing. "The intake manifold casting number," Steve said. "What does it tell you about the factory specification?" Silence. The mockingbird that had been working in the scrub beyond the fence had stopped. The yard was completely quiet. The Arizona morning held everything in place and waited. Steve looked at Curtis Dane steadily. He did not press the silence, did not lean into it or make a performance of it. He simply occupied it, the way a man occupies silence when he already knows how things end and is content to let them arrive. "The carburetor is the wrong model," Steve said then, as if answering his own questions, his voice still entirely even. "It's a common replacement fitted at some point after this car left San Jose. The correct unit is a specific Holly, jetted for the modified intake flow. Without it, the engine runs adequately but well below its design capability. He paused. The valve timing has also drifted. Someone adjusted it to compensate for the wrong carb rather than address the actual problem. Roy Pruitt knew all of this. He had the correct Holly on his parts list. He never got to order it. He said the last sentence without drama. Just a fact, stated plainly, carrying its weight without help. Then he looked at Curtis directly. You didn't come to Dolan Flats for junk, Steve said. You came here hoping nobody else knew it wasn't junk. The yard was very quiet. Curtis Dane looked at Steve McQueen, looked at him the way a man looks at another man when he has understood, fully and without the possibility of comfortable self-deception, that he is not the person in this conversation who knows the most about the subject being discussed, and that this is not going to change. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Curtis looked at Patricia, and Patricia looked back at him with the patient, organized expression of someone who had more documentation in her briefcase and was prepared to use all of it. Curtis picked up his thick folder and held it for a moment. I know who you are, he said quietly. To Steve. Steve said nothing. It doesn't change the legal situation, Curtis said. But the certainty that had been the through line of his voice since arriving had lost something, some structural element that had been holding it up and was no longer there. No, Steve agreed. It doesn't. He walked to the Mustang and released the hood latch and raised it with both hands. He stood beside the open engine bay and looked at what Roy Pruitt had built. But the legal situation is Patricia's department. I'm just talking about the car. He lowered the hood. He stepped back. He was done. Curtis Dane did not give up easily. This was the most revealing thing about him, not his greed, which was ordinary, but his persistence, which was genuine. He had built his career by not stopping when other people became uncomfortable, by treating that discomfort as a ceiling for them rather than a signal for himself. He had made a great deal of money this way and had convinced himself it was a form of discipline. He excused himself for 20 minutes. He went to his Continental and used the car phone and talked to his lawyer in Phoenix. When he came back, he had reorganized. The title dispute, as described, is a civil matter, he said to Patricia. It is not criminal, and it does not invalidate a completed sale. My attorney is prepared to file in county court to enforce the preliminary contract between Mr. Voss and myself if necessary. That filing would delay any transfer of the vehicle for months, possibly longer. Filing to enforce a $2,200 purchase contract, Patricia said, while the documented value of the car is on record at $12,000 to $15,000, in a county where June Pruitt has served breakfast to most of the local judiciary for 3 years. She said it without particular heat, as a statement of landscape. That's your choice to make. Curtis shifted. He turned to June. Something changed in his approach. The hard edge softened, replaced by something that was meant to read as reasonableness. Mrs. Pruitt, he said, I want to be fair to you. I'm prepared to offer $3,500 that's above what you and Mr. Voss together received, effectively settling both transactions. You walk away with more money than you started with, and the legal uncertainty goes away today. $3,500, June said, for a $15,000 car, the $15,000 figure. I was here when that figure was discussed, June said. I understand what it assumes. I also understand what $3,500 assumes. She looked at him steadily. It assumes I'm still as uninformed as I was in February. Curtis looked at Danny. Danny was standing slightly behind his mother, notebook in his hands, watching Curtis with an expression that was not hostile but was entirely clear. The expression of a boy who had run out of things to hope for from this particular person and had decided simply to wait for the conversation to end. Son, Curtis said. Don't, June said, quietly, with a completeness that required nothing further. Curtis held the word he'd been about to say. He stood in the Arizona morning with his folders and his clean boots and his legal argument, and he looked at the group in front of him, the lawyer with her organized briefcase, the man by the fence who had just dismantled his credibility with 3 questions and a single sentence, the woman in the diner uniform who was looking at him not with hatred, but with a clear, exhausted, total clarity, and he made a calculation that was, in its way, the most honest thing he had done since arriving in Dolan Flats. He picked up his phone and made one more call. 30 seconds. He hung up. He took a single sheet of paper from his portfolio. He wrote on it. He signed it and dated it and held it out to Patricia. Withdrawal of my deposit claim against Mr. Voss, he said, and withdrawal of my purchase offer. The deposit stays with him." Patricia took it. She read it. She put it in her briefcase. Curtis picked up both folders. He walked to the Continental and got in without looking back, and the white car made a wide turn in the gravel lot and went out onto the main road and drove north and became small against the desert and then disappeared. The horizon taking it the way the horizon takes everything in Arizona completely, without comment. The yard was quiet. Danny let out a long, slow breath that he'd been holding, it seemed, for the better part of 2 days. The paperwork took an hour. Patricia spread the documents across the hood of the 1958 Buick that had served informally as the morning's outdoor desk. The bill of sale unwound the original transaction between June and Harlan, restored clear title to June and Danny jointly, incorporated Roy's notarized notation as a formal element of the new title record, and attached Gerald Fitch's production documentation as provenance. She explained each element as she laid it out, in plain language, without rushing. She had learned over 12 years that the people on the right side of a legal resolution often needed things explained slowly because disbelief was a reasonable response to things going right after they had been going wrong. Harlan signed first, large, deliberate. He said, while signing, "The storage for 3 months' space in the yard, the carrying costs, I'm not charging any of it." Harlan June started. "I'm not charging it," he said. He set the pen down and looked at Danny. "And that gap in the south fence, I'm going to put a proper gate there. Latch on your side, in case you ever need somewhere quiet." Danny looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. June signed second. Her handwriting was clear, and without hesitation, Patricia turned the document toward Danny. She pointed to the joint ownership line June Marie Pruitt and Daniel Roy Pruitt, and to the space below his mother's signature. "Your father put your name on this car," Patricia said simply. "This makes it official." Danny took the pen. He looked at his father's handwriting in the attached copy of the original notation for Daniel Roy Pruitt when he's old enough to finish it, and he signed his name below his mother's. Small, careful, it looked like Roy's handwriting. When it was done, Patricia closed her briefcase with a clean click. "One more thing," Steve said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small paper bag, flat, dense, containing something machined and precise. He held it out to Harlan. "For the Pruitt house on Mesquite Street," he said, "when you have a chance." Harlan looked inside. A machined steel component, clearly genuine, clearly specific to something he couldn't immediately identify. "What is it?" Harlan said. "The next piece," Steve said. "After the carburetor." He looked at Danny. "The parts from Earl Bunker will arrive in a day or two," he said. "Everything on your father's list." Danny stared at him. "All of it?" "All of it," Steve said. "Address is Daniel Roy Pruitt, Mesquite Street." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know how to thank you." "Finish it," Steve said. "That's the thanks." He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he said most things, as if the sentence were exactly the right length, and he saw no reason to add to it. He looked at June. "Your husband wrote your son's name on that car and had it witnessed and stamped," he said. "He knew what he was building. He knew who it was for." A pause. "You don't need to thank me for finding out he was right." June looked at him. She had the letter in her cardigan pocket and had been thinking about it all morning. About that last paragraph. About, "Please give him the time. Roy would have liked you," she said. "Your son told me that," Steve said. "My son was right," she said. Patricia said her goodbyes and drove back to Flagstaff. Harlan went to his office. The yard settled back into its ordinary morning metal and heat, and the sound of the highway in the distance. Steve walked to the Porsche. He opened the door. Danny called from behind him. "Steve." He turned. Danny was standing beside the Mustang with one hand on the fender, 11 years old and small for it, in his patched sneakers, notebook in the hand that wasn't on the car. "Did you come through here on purpose?" Danny said. "Or was it really just the carburetor?" Steve looked at him for a moment. "Carburetor," he said, "and then you." He got in the Porsche. He started the engine running correctly now, the hesitation entirely gone. He pulled out of the lot and turned south, and the desert took him. The box from Earl Bunker arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after Curtis Dane had driven north out of Dolan Flats for the last time. Danny was at school when the delivery man set it on the porch. June came home between shifts, found it, brought it inside, and set it on the kitchen table, and stood looking at it for a moment. Then she understood that this was not hers to open first. She left it exactly where it was. When Danny came home at 3:15 and saw the box, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. "That's it?" he said. "I haven't touched it," June said. He came to the table and opened the box the way his father had always opened, parts deliveries carefully, deliberately, both hands, respecting the contents before confirming them. He lifted each component out and set it on the table and identified it quietly, because Roy had always named parts when he handled them, and Danny had learned it that way and kept the habit without being aware he was keeping it. The Holly carburetor came last, nested in the center of the box with packing paper around it. Danny lifted it out and turned it in his hands and looked at the model number stamped into the body. He looked at it for a long time. "This is the right one," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I know," June said. At the bottom of the box was the folded paper. Danny read it twice, standing at the kitchen table, and then folded it with care and slipped it into his notebook between the page with the engine diagram and the page with Roy's parts list that Danny had copied from memory. June watched him do it and did not ask what it said. She understood from his face that it was between him and whoever had written it, and that some things worked better when they were kept between the right people. That Saturday morning came clear and cool, one of those brief Arizona mornings in August when the heat hasn't yet committed itself, and the sky is a color that feels like a promise being kept. Danny was in the garage by 6:30. He had the manual open on the workbench, propped against Roy's tool rack, exactly where Roy had always propped it. He had the parts from Earl's box arranged in order of installation, the way Roy had taught him to stage components before beginning, so that nothing was searched for in the middle of work, so that the sequence was visible before you committed to it. He had a clean rag and a notepad for his own annotations. He had put on the work apron that had been hanging on the back of the garage door since November, Roy's apron, too large for him, the ties wrapped twice around his waist. He began. He worked through the morning with the patience of someone who understood that this particular work could not be hurried, and that hurrying it would be a form of disrespect to what it represented. He made small mistakes and corrected them. He reread sections of the manual. He verified each connection before moving to the next, and he moved in the sequence Roy had always advocated: understand it first, do it second, verify it third. Magruder walked past the open garage door at 9 o'clock and stopped. She stood quietly in the doorway for a moment, watching. Then she went and got June from the kitchen, and June came and leaned against the doorframe with her coffee and watched her son work at his father's engine with his father's tools, wearing his father's apron. Walt Greeley stopped on his morning walk and stood at the end of the driveway. Pete Schumacher drove past on his way to the feed store, slowed, pulled over, and got out of his truck. Bobby Arlen came around the corner. He had no particular reason to be on Mesquite Street that morning and would not be able to fully account for why he'd turned down it and parked and joined the small, quiet group at the edge of the Pruitt property. Nobody spoke much. They just stood in the Saturday morning and watched a boy finish what his father had started. At noon, Danny lowered the hood. He stood with his hands resting on the closed hood for a moment, the same posture Roy had always taken after completing a significant stage. A pause before the next thing, a kind of acknowledgement. He turned and looked at his mother. She was at the garage door with the key in her hand. She had gone inside to get it from the kitchen hook while he was finishing the last connections. She held it in both hands, the same way she'd held Roy's letter carefully, as if it might not be real if she gripped it wrong. She held it out. He walked to her. He took the key. His hand was marked with grease, in the exact pattern that Roy's hands had always shown: heel of the palm. First two fingers, the web between thumb and forefinger. He had not noticed. June noticed, and did not say anything, because some things were complete in themselves and did not need to be named. He walked to the driver's door. He got in. He was still slightly small for the seat, still unable to see entirely clearly over the steering wheel, and he understood that this was not about driving. He put both hands on the wheel in the position his father had always held it, thumbs on the lower arc, palms light against the worn grip. He looked at his mother through the windshield. She had come to stand directly in front of the car, both hands pressed flat on the hood, the same way Danny had pressed his hands on the trunk the morning the tow truck had come, confirming through the solid reality of the metal that it was still here, that it was real, that it wasn't going anywhere. He put the key in the ignition. He looked at her one more time. He turned the key. The engine rolled over once. A pause. Rolled over again. On the third turn, it found itself the carburetor opening correctly for the first time, the fuel meeting the rebuilt combustion chambers, the valve timing Roy had set and Danny had confirmed, the whole system recognizing itself and coming to life the way things come to life when they have been built correctly and are finally given the conditions they were made for. The engine smoothed. The sound that came from under that hood was deep and full and entirely certain, not aggressive, not performative, but present in the way that correct things are present, carrying the authority of something that has been built right and knows it. It was the sound Roy Pruitt had heard in his mind every Saturday morning in this garage, the sound he'd been building toward, the sound the engine had always been capable of making. It moved through the garage and out into the yard and into Mesquite Street, and out across the quiet Saturday morning of Dolan Flats, Arizona. Bobby Arlen put his hand over his mouth. Pete Schumacher looked at the sky. Walt Greeley's dog sat down on the sidewalk and tilted its head and listened. May Gruder reached over and took June's hand where it pressed against the hood and held it there and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the engine wasn't already saying. June Pruitt pressed her hands flat on the hood of the car her husband had built and felt the engine running through her palms and into her wrists and up through her arms, and she let whatever happened in her face simply happen, because there was nobody here she needed to protect herself from, and she had been protecting herself for a long time, and Roy was running. Danny sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and his eyes open, looking at his mother's hands on the hood. He was crying. He did not try not to. He sat in his father's seat with the engine turning beneath him, and he cried, the way you cry when something you believed was lost returns in a form that is different from what was lost, but is unmistakably connected to it when what comes back isn't the person, but is the person's work, and the person's love, and the person's intentions, all of it still present, still running, still absolutely good. He sat with it for a long time. Then he turned the key. The engine went quiet. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of something that has proven itself and can rest, knowing it will be asked again and will answer the same way. Steve McQueen's Porsche cleared the outskirts of Dolan Flats before 7 that morning, heading south on a highway that ran straight and honest into the desert. He drove with the window down. The morning air at that hour still held the night's relative cool, carrying the particular freshness that exists only in the window between darkness and heat, a smell of dry scrub and open rock, and something that was almost, if you were willing to be generous, the distant memory of the sea. He drove at an easy 70, with his left arm resting on the door and the engine running cleanly, the hesitation that had brought him to Dolan Flats entirely resolved. He was not thinking about the town he was leaving. He had done what needed doing there, and it was behind him, settled, complete, properly arranged. The road ahead was what the road was for. But the sound of that Mustang engine, running correctly for the first time in the morning air of a salvage yard that stayed with him, not as a thought but as a sensation. The way certain sounds stay in you after the source is gone, residing somewhere below conscious thought, surfacing at unexpected moments for the rest of your life. He drove south and disappeared into the desert morning, the way certain people disappear not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the natural completeness of someone who has always known when to leave. In Dolan Flats, time passed the way time passes in small towns, not quickly, not slowly, but completely, filling every corner. Danny went back to school in September. He kept his notebook on his desk, and when teachers asked about the engine diagrams, he explained what they were. And occasionally, a teacher would study the drawings longer than necessary before handing the notebook back a recognition that Danny understood and did not comment on. Roy had taught him that if you understood a thing well enough to explain it to someone who didn't, you understood it completely. The drawings were proof of complete understanding. He worked on the Mustang every weekend through that fall and the following spring. The restoration was not fast and was not supposed to be. It rewarded patience and punished shortcuts, which meant it was exactly the kind of work Roy Pruitt would have designed for his son if he'd had the chance to design it deliberately. Danny worked through the suspension, the brakes, the electrical system, the bodywork, learning each system the way his father had taught him to learn things, understand the principle before touching the part, read before doing, do carefully, do again until your hands knew what your mind already knew. June bought him a proper tool set for Christmas. She bought it with money saved from the Sunday she'd started working again, She did not tell him how long she'd been saving, and he did not ask. Harlan Voss came by Mesquite Street on a Saturday in October, ostensibly to return a borrowed tool, actually to look at the car's progress. He assessed it with the practiced eye of 23 years in the salvage business and said, "Your dad would say this is right." He left before Danny could respond to it properly. A retired body man named Gus Albright worked out of a shop on the south end of town. Danny showed up one afternoon to ask questions about the dent in the rear quarter panel, the one Roy had always meant to pull. Gus looked at Danny's notebook diagrams and said, "Sit down. I've got things to show you." He showed Danny techniques that took a year to use and would take a lifetime to forget. Gerald Fitch sent a letter in November confirming the car's full provenance and noting that when the family was ready, he had contacts at specialty auction houses with considerable interest. He did not push. He said, "No rush. Some things appreciate differently than money, and it would be a shame not to let them." June read the letter and put it in Roy's box, which now lived on the bookshelf rather than under the bed. The dent in the rear quarter panel took Danny 6 months to address correctly. He practiced on a salvaged panel Harlan gave him. He did the work himself, with the patience of someone who understood that this particular square foot of metal had been waiting since Roy's time, and it deserved to be done right. Summer of 1970, Danny was 15. The car was close to finished, close enough that when he started the engine, which he did regularly, to run it properly and keep it right, it ran with the smooth authority of a thing that has been built correctly and maintained correctly and has no outstanding argument with the world. He drove it for the first time on a Tuesday morning in June 1970, down Mesquite Street and around the block and back to the driveway, sitting on a folded moving blanket to see over the wheel properly, which was not dignified but was necessary. He parked in the driveway and sat with the engine off for a while. Then he went inside and wrote 3 pages in a new notebook, not engine diagrams this time, but notes about how the car drove, what needed attention, what his father had gotten exactly right. A collector came that fall with an offer. He said exceptional and rare, and considerable interest in the collector community several times. He named a number with more digits than Danny had expected. Danny said no. He said it the way Roy would have said it, simply, without extended explanation, because some decisions don't require justification to the person being told no, only to yourself, and Danny had already worked it out. June asked him about it that evening. He offered well, Danny said. "Yes," June said. "Dad didn't build it to sit in someone's climate-controlled garage," Danny said. "He built it to drive." He paused. "We haven't driven it to California yet." June was quiet for a moment. She thought about Roy's handwriting at the back of the manual. "That is a promise I intend to keep." "Next summer," she said. "Next summer," he said. Summer of 1971. Danny was 16, licensed, and had been driving the Mustang around Dolan Flats with the particular care of someone who understands that what they're operating is irreplaceable, not because it's valuable, though it is, but because its value is of the kind that cannot be reconstructed. They left on a Tuesday morning in July. June took a week off from Pauline's, the first real vacation since Roy. She packed a bag and Danny packed a bag, and they put both in the trunk of the Mustang, which closed with the solid, certain sound of a properly restored car. Danny drove. June rode in the passenger seat with the window down and her arm resting on the door, in the posture she'd always had when Roy drove, a position her body had not forgotten in 6 years, muscle memory carrying what the mind sometimes found too heavy to hold directly. They drove west out of Dolan Flats on Route 89 inches the early morning, the desert opening in all directions. The Mustang engine, running the way Roy had written it, would run clean and deep and steady, like it had somewhere to be, and no particular hurry about getting there. Danny drove with 2 hands on the wheel at first, and then one, and then with the easy confidence of someone who has spent 5 years learning exactly how the car beneath him likes to be held. He had Roy's instincts, the ones June had watched develop, recognizing them the way you recognize a particular gesture or an expression, a thing that comes from somewhere specific and cannot be fully explained. They stopped for breakfast in Needles, California, at a small diner with vinyl stools and a coffee machine that complained. A waitress named Dolores, who had worked there since 1952, looked at the Mustang through the window and said, "Now that is something." They ate eggs and toast and did not talk much, because the drive was the talking, and they both understood that. They reached the coast in the early afternoon. Danny found a gravel pullout above the Pacific Coast Highway where the land ended and the water took over. He shut off the engine. He got out. June got out. They stood at the edge of the continent and looked at the Pacific. It was larger than either of them had understood from pictures. Not just wide present, filling the entire western horizon with a blue that had no equivalent in the desert they had driven from. A blue that was not the sky's blue or the Mustang's blue or any other blue they knew, but its own particular blue, the blue of something that has existed longer than any of the words used to describe it. The wind came off the water. It moved June's hair and pressed Danny's shirt against his chest and smelled of salt and distance and the accumulated weight of everything that lay west of everything they had ever known. Danny put his hands in his jacket pockets. He stood at the edge of America and looked at the ocean and thought about his father. Roy Pruitt had never stood here, had never gotten the chance. But Danny could construct it clearly. Roy in his work jacket with the collar up, hands probably in his pockets too, looking at this water with the particular expression he'd had whenever something exceeded what he'd expected. Not surprise, but a widening, a making of room. That is a promise I intend to keep. He kept it. The thought arrived simply, without ceremony, and settled. He kept it. Through Danny, he kept it. The notarized title, and the parts list, and the letter to June, and the engine built carefully enough that a man with a flashlight in a dark salvage yard could recognize what it was. All of it had been Roy pointing forward. Roy arranging the future as best he could from where he stood. Roy trusting that if he built things right, they would hold. They had held. Danny stood at the edge of the continent where the land ran out of argument and the ocean began its own. And he understood something that he would carry for the rest of his life, that a promise doesn't die with the person who made it. It waits. It waits in a manual on a workbench, and a name on a title document, and a car that someone built with everything they had, for reasons that were always larger than resale value. It waits for someone to finish it. Behind them, the Mustang sat in the gravel with the engine cooling ticking softly as metal contracts, the small honest sounds of a machine returning to itself after work well done. The paint was the color Roy had called honest, that complicated faded blue that changed depending on the light, and in the afternoon light above the Pacific, it was the most itself it had ever been. Neither blue nor gray, but the particular color of things that have been through enough to stop pretending to be anything other than what they are. June reached over and took Danny's hand. He was 16 years old and almost as tall as Roy now, and his hand was the hand of someone who had learned to work rough at the palm, marked at the knuckles, carrying the faint, permanent staining of engine work that no amount of soap entirely removes. Roy's hands had looked exactly like this. She had always loved Roy's hands. She held on and looked at the ocean. They stayed for a long time, long enough for the light to shift and soften, for the afternoon's warmth to begin its slow concession to the evening coming off the water. The shadow of the ridge behind them reached the edge of the lot. The first cool of the coast settled around them gently. Then Danny said, "You want to drive back through Big Sur?" June looked at him. "That's the long way." "I know," he said. She looked at the ocean one last time. "Yes," she said. He helped her back into the passenger seat the way Roy had always helped her hand at the door, closing it firmly, making sure it latched. He walked around to the driver's side and got in and settled into the seat that had been his father's and was now his, that carried in its cushions and its frame the accumulated weight of 2 generations of sitting, the impression of Roy's years and his own growing portion of them. He put the key in. He turned it. The engine came up clean and immediate, without hesitation, without negotiation, just the deep familiar voice of something built correctly, running because it was made to run, exactly as designed and intended and promised. For a moment, one of those moments that don't announce themselves in advance but are recognizable afterward as the ones that mattered for a moment, the sound of that engine contained everything. Roy in the garage on a weekend morning, Danny at 7 years old learning the names of parts, the amber tow truck lights sweeping a salvage yard in the dark, a man in a plain jacket who had seen something worth seeing and decided to do something about it, a lawyer's briefcase closing over a clean title, a box of parts addressed to a boy's name, a letter folded twice in a cardigan pocket, an engine turning over for the first time on a Saturday morning on Mesquite Street while a neighborhood stood still and understood what it was hearing. All of it in that sound. All of it continuing. Danny looked at his mother. She was looking at the road ahead with her arm on the door and the coastlight on her face, and she looked, in this moment, like someone who has set something down that she has been carrying for a very long time, and discovered that her hands feel right without it. Danny put the car in gear. The Mustang moved forward onto the coastal highway, heading north into the last long light of the day, the ocean to the left going gold and silver and deep, the hills to the right going warm. The road going on ahead of them, the way roads go when you have done what you came to do, and the distance ahead is simply the next part of being alive and meaning to stay that way. The engine ran clean. Roy Pruitt's engine, Roy Pruitt's car, Roy Pruitt's son, Roy Pruitt's promise, finally, completely, and at last kept. They drove north until the road turned gold, and the first stars appeared above the hills, and the Pacific held all its light below them on the left, and the Mustang ran and ran and ran, steady and deep and real, doing exactly what it had always been built to do, going exactly where it had always been meant to go.